So Clark, of all the enlightened men that started what became these United States, George Washington is always considered our founding father. Why is that?
That's a great question, Rob. The story that I have developed, if you will, hopefully will answer that question. The story has been entitled George Washington, a Great and a Good Man. George Washington's greatness is established by the fact that he played three seminal roles in our nation's founding. The first role was as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, victorious over England, from which we earned our independence. The second role that Washington played was the President of the Constitutional Convention. That was a body of men, 39 men at the end, that issued forth unto the world our U.S. Constitution, which of course is the document that frames our national government. It creates Congress, the office of the President, and the Supreme Court. George Washington served as the president of that body. The Constitution is today the most important, the most influential secular document in the history of the world, certainly in the history of Western civilization. And the third role is the one that first comes to mind when we think of the father of our country. He was our nation's first president. He was elected unanimously, and he was re-elected unanimously. Historians tell us that if they had conducted polls at the end of his second term, he would have received a 90% popularity rating. And at that time, there were no term limits on the presidency. There is a term limit now with which you might be familiar. A two-term limit, that came about in 1951 with the ratification of the 22nd Amendment. Back then, there were no term limits. Washington chose not to run for a third term, when in fact, historians tell us he could have easily been reelected. And the fact that he didn't run for a third term is very important, and we'll come back to that as we move through our story. And it seems to this storyteller that service in any one of those three roles, Commander-in-Chief, President of the Constitutional Convention, our first president, would merit the accolade of greatness. Service in all three elevates Washington to the very summit of greatness in our nation's history. Which begs the question, where does Washington rate in world history, in Western civilization? I think the way I would answer that question is dependent on our view of what the position of the United States is in world history. If the United States is at the top of the other nations, which I believe that it is in the sense of its nobility, its openness, its toleration, its goodness, its generosity. That being so, to the extent that the United States is the greatest or among the greatest nation in the history of the world, then Washington would be at the very pinnacle of greatness in world history. But service in those three roles doesn't necessarily tell us about Washington's goodness. Washington's goodness is determined by what he did as Commander-in-Chief, President of the Constitutional Convention, and as our first president. And the purpose of my story is to share with you and our viewers a bit of a memory refresher, if you will, of Washington's greatness, and to share with you facts that merit goodness. Washington's greatness and his goodness. And as we move through our story, there are two underlying themes that I'd like for us to keep in mind. The first is that Washington did not overtly seek any of these three roles of responsibility. In fact, he didn't want any of these three roles. He reluctantly accepted these roles when he was asked. But once he accepted these roles, he performed to the very best of his ability and reached such a degree of excellence that he earned great power and influence over the military and the people, which takes us to the second theme. George Washington, unlike all other comparable figures in Western civilization, save only one, relinquished power. Only one other comparable figure who had risen to glory on the battlefield, moved into the political arena, ultimate power over the military and the people. Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus, ancient Rome, 450 BC, had ultimate power. Cincinnatus relinquished ultimate power and retired to his farm. George Washington relinquished ultimate power and retired to his farm. That second theme is the pinnacle, not only of greatness, but of goodness. And the relinquishment of power is what I hope will be conveyed today as George Washington's most important contribution to our nation and to history. So let's move into our story. Kind of three parts. Washington as Commander-in-Chief, Washington as President of the Constitutional Convention, and Washington as our first president. Commander-in-Chief. When George Washington was sworn in as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he was charged with the responsibility of defending the 13 colonies, and in turn, developing a strategy and waging war against England. England at the time had the mightiest navy the world had ever seen. One of the three strongest armies, the other two, France, Russia. So it had the mightiest military in world history. And England had the strongest economy the world had ever seen. Not just then, but the world had ever seen. So England, with its combination of military and economic prowess, was, in today's lexicon, what we would say the mightiest superpower in the world. George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, was the Commander-in-Chief of an army of one. There was no Continental Army. There were no officers, there were no soldiers, no cannon, muskets, no uniforms, blankets. There were no shoes. There wasn't even money to pay for the creation of that army. There was simply the promises of representatives from all 13 colonies that they would provide the manpower, the munitions, and the money. And what Washington would soon find out, those promises would ring hollow in many instances. Even in hindsight, scholars tell us that it seems impossible that we could have prevailed. There's an interesting vignette. Shortly after Washington was sworn in, he encounters a fellow Virginian, the great Patrick Henry, who gave us that iconic phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." We know about this meeting of these two titans by a letter that Patrick Henry wrote to a friend, in which Mr. Henry writes, "Yesterday, I met with the newly elected Commander-in-Chief. He approached me with tears in his eyes, and he said, 'Mr. Henry, remember this, from the day I take command of the armies, I mark my fall and the ruin of my reputation.'" That's humility. That's modesty. Confucius tells us that a superior man is modest in his speech, superior in his deeds. Not only is it humility, it's courage, selflessness, sacrifice, patriotism. Washington was a man of great virtue. As we all know, the war lasted for 8 long, grueling years. It was the longest war in our nation's history until Vietnam. Professor from the University of Southern California, Peter Mankow, tells us that Washington's victory over the English was the most improbable military victory in all of Western civilization. How did he do it? How did our Continental Army perform what is seemingly an impossible task? Scholars tell us that Washington's role was pivotal. Some scholars say that without Washington, it is improbable that we could have prevailed. Other scholars use the word unlikely that we could have prevailed. James Thomas Flexner, one historian back in his book in 1963, 1964, uses the word indispensable. Edward Lingen, who's regarded as the preeminent scholar of Washington as commander-in-chief, tells us that Washington was irreplaceable. In other words, we couldn't win the war without George Washington. Well, what was it that was so important? What was it about Washington that made him indispensable? Was he a brilliant military strategist of the ilk of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon? No. George Washington was a farmer. He would have said a planter. Today we say a farmer. He was not a military man. So what was it about Washington that made him so important? What these scholars tell us, it was his character, his sense of virtue that sets him apart from all others. Character? How does character win a war? Maybe character wins a battle or a couple battles. How does it win a war? Let's share some little vignettes, facts that illustrate Washington's character, and thus we get a sense of its importance and how that character basically cultivated a loyalty amongst the fellow soldiers, and then in due time amongst the people of the 13 colonies. And on July 4, 1776, they became the 13 states. The soldiers and the people began to understand that sense of character. And those soldiers were fighting for His Excellency, as he was frequently called, as much as for the cause. If you think about it, do you think those soldiers even knew where England was? Many of them didn't. But they knew this man, George Washington, deemed it in their best interest that they sacrifice, if need be, everything in the furtherance of cause. And that cause was liberty, freedom from England. His character, Thomas Jefferson, the year is 1814. Jefferson's been retired from public office for 6 years. Washington has been dead for 14 years. Jefferson is reflecting about the founding of this nation. He writes in a letter about George Washington. George Washington's character was, in the whole and in its mass, perfect. It may be truly said that never has nature and fortune combined so perfectly as to create a great man. That's what Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant Thomas Jefferson, said. Examples of his character. When he was sworn in as commander-in-chief, George Washington refused a salary. Yes, he was offered a salary of $500 a month, a significant sum in those days. I cannot make a profit from this endeavor. He was willing to fight, but only for the worthiness of the cause, not for money. And in due time, the people of London, people of the colonies, heard that this general, George Washington, refused a salary. And that hadn't been done, a refusal of a salary, since the days of antiquity. And the London newspaper described the people of London as thunderstruck when they heard that this General Washington refused a salary. As mentioned, the war lasted 8 long, horrendous years. George Washington never took a day off. He was with his men during those grueling, freezing winters at Valley Forge, Morristown. His soldiers were freezing to death, literally. He was with them every day for those 8 years, except when he was called away on official business to meet with representatives of the Continental Congress, not to be confused with today's U.S. Congress. General officers never spent extended periods of time with their soldiers. They were living in the lap of luxury back then. Washington was with his men. And in due time, the people of London and the people of the United States, they learned of this, and they must surely have been asking themselves, who is this man, George Washington? George Washington cared more about the safety and welfare of his men than he did himself. When in battle, when retreating from the English, as was often the case, Washington was in the rear, the most vulnerable of positions, making sure that his men were moving towards safety. When engaged in battle, he was either off to the side or in front, leading them, always overseeing, supervising. One battle, the Battle of Morristown, illustrates his courage and his concern about his fellow men. And to say that he was courageous doesn't really do him justice. He was fearless in battle. The British redcoats were on one side and Washington's Continental Army on the other. They were a mere 100 feet apart, maybe the distance of our front yard, firing at each other with muskets. And the British were about to take the day. Washington is off to the side, astride his horse, watching the battle. And as his men began to retreat, he rides in on his horse. Thomas Jefferson tells us that George Washington was the greatest horseman of the age. He rides in between the competing forces. His only protection is the smoke from the musket fire. Hold your ground, my boys, hold your ground. There is but a handful of them. We can prevail. His men see His Excellency in this state of peril. They halt, they turn, retrench, re-engage, and indeed they take the day. And we know about this in part because of a letter that one of Washington's fellow officers wrote, who bore witness to this scene, in which he tells his wife, "My dearly beloved, yesterday I witnessed such courage as I could never have imagined. His Excellency rode into the fire, 1,000 deaths flying all around him, his life hanging by a single hair. I assure you, my dear, I feared not for myself, but only for this bravest of all men." And in due time, the people of the United States began hearing and then understanding. And then they came to realize that Washington was one of the richest men in the colonies in the States. But this man was willing to risk every material thing that he held dear. His Mount Vernon, even his beloved Martha, and of course his own life in the furtherance of a principle: liberty, freedom. Richest man in the colony risked everything for this cause. Toward the end of the war, when it was evident that George Washington and the Continental Army would prevail, he had cultivated such a degree of loyalty, ardor, that representatives of his officer corps approached him to assure him that when the war's over, when he becomes king, they would support him. King? Of course he would be king. Every nation in the world at that time was ruled by a king, a queen, a chieftain. So it was only natural that Washington be king. To which Washington replied, "Nothing that has come to my attention throughout the course of this war disturbs me so much as your suggestion that I would accept such a position. What is it about my conduct that makes you think I would be receptive?" And he dismissed these men. "Never are you to speak of this again." The point is, Washington would not be king. Washington, at the end of the war, surrendered his commission to the Continental Congress. He, in ceremonial fashion, presented his sword to Congress as an indication of resigning his commission, and I like to think of that ceremonial presentation as almost literally turning his sword into a plowshare. He returned home. Historians tell us at this moment in history, he had ultimate power over the military and unflinching loyalty from all the people. He could be king. Thomas Fleming, a historian, tells us that Washington's relinquishment of ultimate power is the greatest event in our nation's history. And if it is, that could certainly be the greatest secular event in all of world history. He relinquished power. The King of England, George III, shortly after the war, he was having his portrait painted, as he was wont to do. The portraitist was Benjamin West, an American painter. The king, "Mr. West, now that the war is over and General Washington has prevailed, will he stay on as head of the military, or will he become chief of state, or both?" And Benjamin West replied, "Your Highness, I am told he has retired to his farm." Benjamin West described the king as thunderstruck. Again, that word. As the king bellowed, "If that be so, he will be the greatest man on earth." In that relinquishment of ultimate power, Washington did what Julius Caesar couldn't do, Augustus Caesar couldn't do it, Charlemagne, Oliver Cromwell, all before Washington. They couldn't relinquish ultimate power. And shall we say comparable figures after the war: Napoleon, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and in our own time, Fidel Castro, victorious in situations similar to battle, acquire ultimate power. They can't relinquish power. Fidel Castro can't relinquish power. Washington, unlike all other comparable figures in Western civilization, save only the great Cincinnatus that I mentioned earlier, relinquished ultimate power and retired to his farm. Which takes us to the second role, actually a 5-year period from the end of the war in 1783 up until the commencement of the Constitutional Convention in May of 1787. That's a 4-year period, and then another year after that before the Constitution is ratified. In this period, Washington is in retirement with no intention whatsoever of returning to public life. And remember, if there's no Constitution, there's no Congress, there's no president, and there's no Supreme Court. There's no national government. But all is not well in this fledgling country. The war had taken a devastating toll on the population base. The economy was in shambles, and as a result, we were disuniting. The population toll. The war had cost us the lives of 25,000 boys, and I use the word boys intentionally, most ages 15 to 30, died at the very peak of their productive lives, their reproductive lives. In today's population, that would be the equivalent of between 3 and 4 million boys no longer with us. The economy had shattered. No trade had taken place. Trade of consequence had taken place during the 8-year war. England had been our primary trading partner, so no trade with England. Professor Alan Gelzo at Gettysburg College tells us that inflation roared in some areas 5,000%. The Continental, that was their currency, was worthless. We had incurred a national debt of roughly $70 to $80 million. Who knows what that would be in today's currency? So other countries, they wouldn't trade with us. We had no financial creditworthiness. The states, at least 7 of the 13 states, were printing their own currency. Think of that, 7 of the 13 states using disparate currencies. And also there was Spanish currency, English currency, and Dutch currency, French currency being passed. Nobody knew what to make of the currency. The effect of this unstable economy, the loss to our population, created great uncertainties amongst the people, as you would imagine. And we were disuniting. In other words, we weren't thinking of ourselves as citizens, as members of the United States. It's, I'm a Virginian, I'm a Georgian, and we were retracting. There were elements in Pennsylvania that wanted to disassociate and recognize the King of Spain as their sovereign. A similar group in Georgia wanting recognition by the King of Spain. The monarchs, the oligarchs, the military men of Europe must have just been standing on their shore, looking westward at our nation, wanting us, expecting us to fall apart. They would step in for our natural resources and our human resources. What to do? Washington, along with several of the other great founders, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, note the omission of Thomas Jefferson. Those others all believed that in order to bring stability back to our nation, to unify this country, and unification is important for our national security. In order to do so, we had to create a strong national government. Strong national government, Patrick Henry wailed, George Mason, George Clinton being prominent figures. The idea was abhorrent. A strong national government, history told them that always resulted in a centralization, a consolidation of power. And consolidation of power always, maybe not in the first generation, but over a period of time, results in cronyism, then corruption, then tyranny and despotism. Those are the words they used. We don't use the words tyranny and despotism today. We would say totalitarianism, authoritarianism, Nazism, communism, fascism. Always, when a central government is in place. They consolidate power. It may take several generations, but that eventually takes away the freedom of the people. But Washington and these other men believed that our nation could not survive without a strong central government. Well, who could lead the effort for a strong central government? Washington couldn't. He was in retirement, and he had promised the people that he wouldn't return to public office, promised them by his actions. Benjamin Franklin, he was in his 70s, stricken with gout. John Adams was in England as our minister to England. Jefferson was in France as our minister to France. And that left the door open to two young men in their early 30s, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, to spearhead the effort towards the creation of some central form of government. Madison and Hamilton knew they had Washington's tacit support, but they believed, and historians agree, that Washington's support was not sufficient. His presence was mandatory. Hamilton, with the help of Madison, had succeeded in calling for a convention scheduled to take place in May 1787, Philadelphia. In order to attract delegates from the 13 states, they knew that the greatest man on earth, his presence, not just his support, but his presence was mandatory. Only if Washington is in attendance would the states be willing to send delegates. Would the delegates even come? If they did come, would they work at the task for them? And if they did come up with a product, the people wouldn't accept it unless the people knew the one person who could be trusted with power had overseen the process. Hamilton and Madison, Your Excellency, your presence is necessary. I cannot attend. I have retired. I have told the people that I did not seek power. I cannot. General, your presence is mandatory. Without your presence, there's no chance for success. We can almost see him bow his head. I will attend. And he did. May 24th, 1787, the convention is convened. First order of business at the convention was the election of George Washington. He was elected unanimously. Bearing in mind that the idea of creating a strong central government was very contentious, very divisive, tempers flared, fisticuffs, arguments ensued. But all those delegates knew that the man sitting up there on the dais deemed it to be in their best interest and the best interests of the people of the 13 states that we create a central government. So in due time, under the watchful eyes and the guiding hands of the one man on earth who could be trusted with power, the delegates' arguments turned to debate, the debate turned to compromise. And in a mere 4 months, 39 men at that convention signed off on a draft of the document that provides the framework for our central government. That document, as mentioned earlier, has become, over the past 230 years, the most influential, the most important secular document in world history. And it provided that it would become the law if and only if it's approved by 9 of the 13 states. So out this document goes to the people for their approval. And what is it that the people knew and really understood about this Constitution? Bear in mind, there was nothing like it in world history. the creation of a document whereby the people determined who their leadership would be. Not by heredity, not by birth, but we, the people, determined who the leaders are and how that would function. Nothing like it. People tend to think that, well, what about Athens and Sparta in ancient Greece? What about the Roman Republic? What about the Swiss cantons? They try to draw parallels to those prior time frames in history, but it seems to me that they really aren't applicable to the situation at hand in our nation. This was on a far, far grander scale, what was envisioned by the framers, those delegates. Nothing really like it in all of history. But the people knew that George Washington had overseen the process, that he approved the process, and that he thought this central government was in their best interest. So in June of 1788, a mere 9 months from the time it went out to the people, the requisite 9 states had approved it. And that U.S. Constitution created a central government. That U.S. Constitution would be the supreme law of the land, superior to the law of Georgia, of Virginia, Pennsylvania. The people had to subordinate their state's laws to this law that George Washington believed to be in their best interest. Which takes us to the third role, his presidency. There's only one person in the United States that didn't know who the first president should be. And of course, that was George Washington. Historian Edward Larson says he did not want to be president. He did nothing that remotely resembled campaigning or solicitation of the office. His name was placed in nomination. He was elected unanimously. Which then begs the question, what does the president do? There'd never been a president in history. What does the president do? The Constitution really doesn't spell out much in the way of detail as to what a president does. George Washington created the office of the presidency, historian Gordon Wood tells us. It is today, according to historian Gordon Wood, the powerful office that it is, in large part because of George Washington's initial behavior and thus the willingness of the people to allow him to perform those roles. He wrote a letter to James Madison, who would become what we might think of today as his chief of staff, an advisor during his first term. Washington says to Mr. Madison, everything that we do will establish precedent. Therefore, everything that we do must be governed by true principles. Washington's focus was threefold: cultivate respectability with nations abroad, stabilize the economy, and focus on expansion to the West. He believed that the future of the United States was not east across the Atlantic, but to the West. And in his first term, George Washington negotiated treaties with foreign countries, settled disputes amongst the states and countries in Europe. He established a national bank, a single currency, the dollar, put together a plan for the repayment of that $80 million debt, and actually implemented the prepayment of that debt. Now, I'm not saying that he did it all by himself, of course, but he oversaw the process. He was the key figure. As Thomas Jefferson said, all of his advisors, George Washington's advisors, were like the spokes on a wagon wheel. We, including himself, we revolved around George Washington, who was the hub of the wheel of this nation. He made it possible. By the end of his term, his efforts had been so successful that foreign investment money, particularly from England and Holland, was just pouring in. Our economy had stabilized in his first term. He writes to Madison, Hamilton. Hamilton was his Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson was his Secretary of State, informing them that now that my first term is almost over, I want to pick up my spade and earn my bread. In other words, I want to go home. I want to be a farmer again. Alexander Hamilton says the nation is not ready. Without your unifying presence, we will disunite. Thomas Jefferson says it a bit more colorfully. He says, Mr. President, the North and the South will hang together, but only if we have you to hang on to. We can almost see him bowing his head as he says, I will serve another tour of duty. He didn't want another term. He didn't campaign. He simply allowed his name to be placed in nomination, and again, he was elected unanimously. His second term, all the positives of the first continued forward. There were some difficulties, there were some obstacles, but by the end of his second term, the country had stabilized its economy, and there was a sense of unity that would prevail for the next 65 years against all odds, against the belief by almost everyone other than a select few that this nation could survive. 65 years into the future, that was the outbreak of the Civil War. Washington did retire at the end of his second term, returned to Mount Vernon with his beloved Martha. He'd live another 2.5 years in good health, riding vigorously about his farm, inspecting all that was going on. And on December 14th, 1799, just 2 weeks before the new century, just 2 months before his 68th birthday, George Washington left us. But oh, what a legacy he left us. So let's summarize. Commander-in-Chief. Historians tell us we could not have won the war against England without Washington as Commander-in-Chief. Then Washington as President of the Constitutional Convention. One of the delegates to that convention was James Monroe, a young man then. He would become the 6th President of the United States. James Monroe wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying that George Washington carried this government. In other words, James Monroe is saying that without Washington, his presence at this convention, the delegates would have never reached an agreement, and the people of the United States would not have accepted the Constitution had Washington not overseen it and approved it. Historian Joseph Ellis tells us simply the Constitutional Convention could not have succeeded without Washington. We would not have a Constitution without Washington. As president, historian Ron Chernow tells us that Washington's legacy is a breathtaking list of accomplishments. Gordon Wood, who's regarded as the dean of scholars who focus on the Revolutionary era, Gordon Wood tells us that the period of Washington's presidency, the last decade of the 1700s, was the most fragile, perilous, and awkward period in our nation's history, save only for the Civil War. Gordon Wood goes on to say that it was only through the strength of Washington's character and his sense of virtue that he kept this nation from descending into a monarchy or anarchy. To conclude, George Washington at the end of the war, as we said, had ultimate power, but he relinquished that power. When he relinquished power at the end of the war, he established two precedents. First, this nation would never be ruled by a king. Second, the military will always be subordinate to civilian control. These two principles were inculcated into our U.S. Constitution with its ratification 5 years into the future. No king, no hereditary birthrights. Military, subject to civilian control. Then with respect to the presidency, when Washington chose not to run for a third term, he was telling the people of the United States, he was telling the people of the world, and he was telling all future presidents that the president of the world, the president of the United States, is not the ruler of the people. The president is merely their servant.
And on that, we observe another Independence Day. Thank you so much, Clark Musser.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Rob.